There are moments when something inside us simply goes quiet. It isn't exactly sadness, nor just fatigue. It's as if the soul were watching the old walls of the self crumble. You feel as though you are disappearing, and at the same time, something new begins to breathe through the ruins. Carl Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." But looking within is an arduous task, because when we do, what we first find is not light. It's noise. It's the echo of the masks we wore for so long, the sound of inner voices telling us who we should be. And yet, beneath that quiet turmoil, there is a calling, a subtle murmur that seems to come from a place deeper than the mind. Perhaps you are at that point, between what the ego tries to preserve and what the self is trying to reveal, between the known that is saying goodbye and the unseen that asks to come through. It is a strange territory, like waking up in a body that still remembers old pains but already senses a new consciousness. The ego resists. It fears disappearing. It wants to keep the form of who you used to be. But the self, it doesn't want to destroy the ego. It simply wants you to remember what has always been behind the forms, the spark of being that never ceased to exist. Awakening, therefore, is not a glorious ascent. It is a slow unfurling. It is the moment when the soul whispers, "Stop running from yourself." And in that silence, after the fall, the true rebirth begins. Chapter 1, The Birth of Inner Conflict. There is a moment when a human being awakens to a kind of silent war. It isn't a visible war, but an inner clash between two forces that have always inhabited you. The ego, which wants to remain in the known, and the self, which calls you into the unknown. This is the point at which life stops being mere survival and becomes a crossing. The ego, shaped by the demands of the world, is like an architect who built your house upon what felt safe, beliefs, roles, expectations. It is the guardian of continuity, the one who says, "I am who I've always been." But the self is the wind that blows through the cracks in that house and whispers, "You are far more than what you have built." And it is in this collision between permanence and expansion that the pain of transformation is born. At first, that pain looks like confusion. You wake with the sensation that you no longer fit inside yourself. What once made sense, work, relationships, plans, now feels colorless, as if it had lost its shine. It is the self pressing against the ego's walls, asking for space. And the terrified ego tries to reinforce its structures, saying, "Don't go there. It's dangerous to lose who you were." Many describe this moment as an existential crisis, but through the lens of depth psychology, it's an inner birth. The soul is trying to be born again, but the psychic body, the ego, resists the dilation. That is why there is so much fear, so much doubt, such a strong desire to flee. The ego does not understand that what is dying is not itself, but the illusion of control that sustained it. Jung said that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, because consciousness does not expand without breaking through the shells of what we believed ourselves to be. It is an inner alchemy. The lead of identity melts in the fire of truth, and the gold of the self begins to emerge. At this point, the viewer may realize that the conflict is not a sign of error, it is a sign of life. When the old and the new face off, it is because something sacred wants to be born. The soul, which for so long slept under the weight of masks, begins to move, and the movement of the soul always brings discomfort. If you feel this tension, do not reject it. It is proof that something in you is awakening. Between the ego's fear and the self's calling, there is a bridge. And that bridge is the very process of individuation. It is not crossed in haste, but in presence. For every step on this path is at the same time an ending and a beginning. Chapter 2, The Ego, the Architect of Survival. The ego is the engineer of our earthly existence. It builds walls, charts paths, creates roles and names so we can inhabit the world with some measure of safety. Without it, the psyche would be lost in the vast ocean of the unconscious. With it, we learn to say I, to distinguish inside from outside, the possible from the impossible. Jung saw the ego not as an enemy, but as a structure necessary to human experience. It is through it that we interact with reality and that consciousness anchors in the body. Yet what is born as a tool of adaptation can, over time, become a prison. When the ego forgets its symbolic origin and believes itself to be the absolute center, it ceases to serve the soul and begins to feed on it. The ego fears dissolution because it believes it is the totality, but it is only a small island surrounded by an infinite ocean of the unconscious. Even so, it struggles, plans, attempts to control the flow of life. It is the master of masks, the personas we wear to survive, the exemplary professional, the strong partner, the spiritually balanced one. Masks that help us function, but that silently suffocate the authentic being living behind them. Imagine a successful man, respected, admired. Everything around him seems perfect, but at night, when the silence reaches him, something unsettles him. He realizes he lives inside an armor, one that protected him from rejection, but distanced him from his own soul. This is the moment when the ego begins to crack, and the cracks, as frightening as they may be, are portals. The ego believes its mission is to control, but its true function is to integrate. It is the messenger between the visible and the invisible, between body and spirit. When it understands its place, it becomes a faithful servant of the self. But as long as it crowns itself king, it lives at war with everything that transcends it. In many moments, the ego is driven by fear, fear of not being enough, of being rejected, of disappearing. Thus it creates narratives, justifications, plans. And the more it tries to assert itself, the further it strays from the natural flow of existence. The self, by contrast, does not need to prove anything, it simply is. Perhaps the conflict you feel arises from this ancestral misunderstanding, trying to uphold control where life is asking for surrender. It is not about killing the ego, but educating it, teaching it to bow before the vastness of being. When the ego learns to serve the self, something sacred happens. The human and the divine begin to dance in the same body. Chapter 3. The Self, the Divine Spark in Expansion. The self is the hidden center of the psyche, the quiet point where the human and the divine meet. Jung described it as the archetype of totality, the invisible intelligence guiding the soul toward its wholeness. While the ego says, "I am this," the self whispers, "You are far more than you imagine." It does not speak in words, it communicates through symbols, dreams, intuitions, and synchronicities, subtle signs of a field vaster than thought. Unlike the ego, the self seeks neither control nor recognition nor certainty. It is pure presence. It is the space that holds both light and shadow, love and fear, pain and expansion. And when that presence begins to emerge, something within us remembers what it has always been. It is not about learning something new, but remembering your own center, the original spark that was always there, even when forgotten. Imagine an ancient flame lit in the midst of an inner desert. The ego runs, builds, protects. The self simply illuminates. And as this light expands, it does not destroy the ego. It integrates it, soothes it. Because the self is not an adversary, it is home. The being is the space in which the content of life happens. Some contemporary teachers say, the self is that space. It is the consciousness that observes thought, feeling, the body, without confusing itself with them. When you access it, you still feel pain, but something in you is no longer the pain. You begin to witness, and in that quiet witnessing, freedom arises. The expansion of the self is not an extraordinary event. It is a practice of remembrance. Every time you choose presence over reaction, truth over appearance, quiet over noise, the self shows itself. It is an invisible dance between being and becoming, a communion with something that transcends you and yet lives within you. Pause now, breathe, feel the air move in and out of the body like a wave that comes and goes. Notice there is something in you that observes all of this and remains untouched. That is the self. It is not far away, not in some distant temple. It is the temple. And as this consciousness expands, the outer world changes shape, not because anything outside has transformed, but because the inner gaze has awakened. The spark that once slept in silence now remembers. It is the fire of being, and being is infinite. Chapter 4. The Invisible Battle. When the old self tries to resist. Every true transformation awakens resistance. Fearing the unknown, the ego clings to the ruins of what once made it feel safe. It does not understand that the self did not come to destroy it, but to free it from the illusion of control. So when the self begins to emerge, the ego reacts, and that reaction can be confusing, painful, almost unbearable. It is at this point that many feel they are regressing. Old wounds reappear, patterns return, emotions seem more intense than ever. But it isn't regression, it's revelation. The unconscious, now lit by the presence of the self, brings to the surface everything that was hidden, everything the ego learned to conceal in order to keep existing. Imagine an old house being renovated. To build the new, you need to remove the plaster, expose the cracks, deal with the dust. So it is with the inner process. The ego screams because its walls are being touched. It fears collapse, but does not know that without collapse there is no room for a new foundation. This invisible battle is the field of individuation. On one side, the ego tries to maintain the known. On the other, the self calls you into the vastness of being. Between them, the human feels split, torn between the impulse to remain and the desire to transcend. It is the essential paradox of awakening, dying in order to remain alive. At this point, many seek external answers, gurus, doctrines, promises of peace, but the true teacher lives in the silence between the voices. Jung said that the soul is a dark forest where there is more than one path. The self does not point to the easiest way, but to the truest one. And with every step in that forest, the ego tries to turn back, shouting that it is dangerous. But the danger it fears is the end of illusion, the awakening of consciousness. Resistance is sacred. It shows that something real is being touched. Without resistance, there is no transformation, only escape. The ego needs to struggle so that the self may be born through that struggle. This is how the psyche matures, through the tension of opposites. Jung called it enantiodromia, the natural movement by which everything extreme tends to turn into its opposite. Crisis, then, is the beginning of integration. If you feel something in you resisting, welcome it tenderly. Do not fight the fight. Observe, just observe. The soul works in silence, even when the ego screams. And in the instant when the fatigue of resisting becomes surrender, the self reveals itself, not as victory, but as peace. Chapter 5. Surrender and Awakening. There comes a moment when the exhaustion of fighting becomes greater than the fear of falling. And in that instant, something subtle happens. Not by conquest, but by letting go. The ego, worn out from trying to control the uncontrollable, begins to open. It does not disappear. It simply bows before what transcends it. And what transcends it is the self, the consciousness that observes it, welcomes it, and holds it with a peace it could never manufacture. Surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the soul recognizing that there is nothing left to prove. It is the human self finally allowing itself to be embraced by totality. When this happens, a new state of presence is born. Quiet, serene, vast. There is no sudden illumination, just a stillness that once felt impossible. The body still feels, emotions still ebb and flow, but something within you no longer identifies with the chaos. Consciousness observes, and in that observing, it finds freedom. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Surrender is that, letting the darkness come, without running. Because when shadow is looked at with love, it dissolves into understanding. Pain, once seen as an enemy, becomes a teacher, and the ego which once shouted learns to listen. This is the point at which awakening begins to reveal itself, not as a supernatural event, but as a gentle remembrance. I was never separate. The self, which seemed distant, shows itself present in every breath, every gaze, every silence. Everything that seemed fragmented begins to align, not because the world changed, but because the inner gaze became truer. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight on your shoulders. Allow the air to enter and leave without effort. There is nothing to solve right now. Just notice there is something in you that observes all this, and that something remains unshaken. That is the self. The quiet witness, the unchanging center that has always been there, waiting for the ego to tire enough to listen. Surrender is where the human and the divine meet again. The ego, once a warrior, becomes a servant of love, and the self, once distant, becomes the very breath of life. Awakening, after all, is not an escape from the world. It is the remembrance that the whole world lives within you. Chapter 6. Integration. The human who remembers the divine. After surrender, there is no triumph or crowns. There is silence, and in that silence a new life begins, not outside, but within. The ego, now less inflamed, learns to serve the self like an apprentice before a master. It understands that its function is not to dominate, but to manifest, and the self, with infinite patience, guides it to transform consciousness into presence, presence into action. This is how the human begins to remember the divine, not by fleeing the earth, but by rooting the sky within. Integration is the moment when the soul descends into the body. It is when the spiritual stops being a concept and becomes a gesture. Gentleness returns to words, patience to the eyes, love to the everyday. The ego, once rigid, becomes flexible, like a branch that bends to the wind. And life, once perceived as a battlefield, reveals itself as a school of compassion. It is not a permanent state of light. It is a dance between shadow and clarity. The self does not eliminate the ego, it educates it. And the ego, when it yields to the soul, becomes a channel for inner wisdom. You still feel anger, fear, insecurity, but now something in you observes with tenderness, and that changes everything. Emotion no longer dominates you, it teaches you. Pain no longer defines you, it reveals you. On the path of individuation, Jung said that the goal is not to become perfect, but whole. Whole is the being who welcomes error without self-punishment, who recognizes shadow without getting lost in it, who allows themselves to be human without forgetting they are spirit. Integration is, therefore, a sacred marriage between the sky and the earth of one's own being. It is consciousness breathing within imperfection. Try observing your day through this new lens. Every encounter, every quiet moment, every obstacle is an opportunity to realign with the self. There are no steps to climb, only layers to remember. And with each remembrance, presence grows. You begin to realize that life was never against you. It was always the mirror of what you needed to see to remember who you are. Integration is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of spiritual maturity. It is when you stop seeking light and begin to be light. The ego becomes the soil, the self, the seed, and together they bloom as human and divine, body and soul, finitude and eternity, coexisting in peace in the same heart. Conclusion: the return to center. At the end of the crossing, what remains is silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the one that pulses beneath all noise, holding up your being. Between the ego and the self, you discovered there were never enemies, only parts of the same consciousness trying to recognize itself. The ego wanted to survive, the self wanted to remember. And in their meeting, the awakened human was born, one who breathes the mystery with humility and gratitude. Carl Jung said that the individuation process is the path back to the center, where soul and instinct are reconciled. It is not about being perfect, but whole. Whole enough to look at your own chaos without getting lost, to embrace fear without surrendering to it, to recognize that the divine is not far away, it dwells in the human heart. Awakening is not the end of pain, but the beginning of consciousness. It is when you understand that every loss was a call to return to yourself, that every resistance was merely the fear of surrendering to the love that always held you, and that the silence so often feared is in fact the temple where the self lives. Now breathe. Feel the space between the inhale and the exhale. That interval is the center. It is where the soul rests, where the human remembers to be divine. Between the ego and the self, there is only one heart learning to beat with more truth. If this video spoke to your journey, share it. Write in the comments, where are you on this crossing? And remember, awakening is not a destination, it is a return to the center where being simply is.